Amara Grant sat before Richard Collins' desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather chair beneath her felt cold, almost as though it wasn't meant for her. Richard hadn't lifted his eyes from the papers he was reviewing, the soft scratching of his pen the only sound in the room, grating on her already frayed nerves. At last, Richard set the pen aside and leaned back in his chair, his gaze meeting hers with the same calculated expression she'd seen countless times before. "Amara," he said, his voice calm but distant, "I assume this isn't about work." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind for days, but now, sitting here in front of him, her voice seemed lodged in her throat. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. "No, it's not," she whispered, staring at her hands. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard didn't move, didn't react. It was as if he hadn't heard her at all. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last, until finally he spoke. "I see," he said, his tone indifferent. "That's it? Nothing more?" Amara blinked, her heart still racing. "It's yours, Richard," she added, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought you should know." Richard sighed, leaning forward in his chair, elbows resting on the desk as he steepled his fingers in front of him. "Amara," he began, his tone cold and measured. "This is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her voice trembled, disbelief creeping in. She had expected shock, maybe anger, but this indifference? "Yes," Richard said, his gaze unwavering. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach churned. We were careful," she stammered, desperation seeping into her voice. "Clearly not careful enough," he replied, his words slicing through her like ice. He leaned back again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And now you're telling me this because, what? You expect me to do something about it?" Amara's throat tightened. She hadn't thought this far ahead, hadn't expected it to go like this. She hadn't anticipated he would be so cold. "I thought you'd want to know," she said softly. "I thought maybe we could figure something out." Richard's face hardened. "Figure something out?" he repeated, his voice mocking. "Amara, you know how this works. I'm married. I have a family. A reputation." He gestured between them. This was never supposed to be more than what it was. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been a fool, and she realized that now. Late nights in his office, whispered promises, stolen moments. She had let herself believe it was something real. But to him it had always been disposable. Amara straightened in her seat, summoning what little courage she had left. "I'm keeping the baby, Richard." He sighed again, rising from his desk and walking to stand in front of her. "I can't be involved in this, Amara. You know that." His voice was firm but calm. "This conversation never happened. Do you understand?" Her blood ran cold. "You're just walking away? Just like that?" "I have to," he said, his tone unyielding. "And so should you." Amara stood, her anger beginning to simmer in her chest. "I can't just walk away from this, Richard. This is your child too." Richard's jaw tightened. "Amara," he warned, his voice low. "I'm telling you, let this go. I've taken care of you, but if you make this a problem for me, I'll make sure you regret it." Her heart sank. "What are you saying?" He didn't answer immediately, simply returning to his desk. When he sat down, his expression was glacial. "I'm saying today is your last day at Collins Associates." Amara froze. "What?" "You can leave quietly," he said, his tone professional, impersonal. "I've already spoken with HR. You'll receive a severance package, of course, but after today you're no longer an employee here." His words hit her like a blow. "You're firing me because I'm pregnant? Because of you? I'm protecting my family, Amara. And you should do the same." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you come after me, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Amara's hands trembled, fury and disbelief warring inside her. She stood there, staring at the man she had once trusted, the man who now looked at her like a threat. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I never thought you'd do this." "You never should have thought otherwise," Richard replied, his voice as calm as if they were discussing a business deal. Amara's vision blurred with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office. As she made her way back to her desk, her legs felt like they were moving on autopilot. Her hands moved mechanically as she packed her belongings, each item slipping into her bag feeling heavier than the last. In the elevator, descending to the lobby, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished walls, trying to hold herself together. But inside she was falling apart. Her job, her future. Everything had been ripped away in a matter of minutes. And now she was alone. Pregnant. Unemployed. Blacklisted from the industry she had worked so hard to succeed in. The tears finally fell as she stepped out onto the street, feeling invisible, just another face in the crowd. No one would ever know the truth. Richard Collins had made sure of that. Amara Grant stood before Richard Collins' desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather chair beneath her felt cold as if it wasn't meant for her. Richard hadn't lifted his eyes from the papers he was reviewing, the soft scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. It gnawed at her nerves. Finally, Richard set the pen aside and leaned back in his chair, giving her the same calculated look she'd seen many times before. "Amara," he said, his voice calm but distant, "I presume this isn't about work." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this conversation for days, but now, sitting in front of him, her voice felt trapped in her throat. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. "No, it's not," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard didn't move, didn't react. It was as if he hadn't heard her. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, until finally he spoke. "I see. Is that all?" Amara blinked, her heart still racing. "It's yours, Richard," she added, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought you should know." Richard sighed, leaning forward in his chair, elbows resting on the desk as he laced his fingers together. "Amara," he began, his tone cold and measured, "this is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her voice wavered, disbelief creeping in. She had expected shock, maybe anger, but this indifference? "Yes," Richard said, looking her directly in the eyes now, his expression icy. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach twisted. She stammered. "We were careful." "Clearly not careful enough," he replied, his words slicing through her like ice. He leaned back again, narrowing his eyes slightly. "And now you're telling me because you, what? Expect me to do something about it?" Amara's throat tightened. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought he would be so cold. "I thought you'd want to know," she said softly. "I thought maybe we could figure something out." Richard's face hardened. "Figure something out?" he repeated, his voice growing colder. "Amara, you know how these things work. I'm married. I have a family, a reputation." He gestured vaguely between them. This was never supposed to be anything more than what it was. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been a fool, she saw that now. Late nights in his office, whispered promises, stolen moments. She had let herself believe it was something real. But to him it had always been disposable. Amara straightened in her chair, gathering what little courage she had left. "I'm keeping the baby, Richard." He sighed again, standing up from his desk and walking to stand in front of her. "I can't be involved in this, Amara. You know that. This conversation never happened. Understand?" Her blood ran cold. "You're just walking away?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have to," he said, his voice firm but calm. "And so should you." Amara rose to her feet, anger beginning to burn in her chest. "I can't just walk away from this, Richard. It's your child too." Richard's jaw clenched. "Amara, I'm warning you, let this go. I've taken care of you, but if you make this a problem for me, I'll make sure you regret it." Her heart sank. "What are you saying?" He didn't answer immediately, simply returning to his desk. When he sat down, his expression was ice cold. "I'm saying this is your last day at Collins Associates." Amara froze. "What?" "You can be quietly dismissed," he said, his tone professional, impersonal. "I've already spoken with HR. You'll receive a severance package, of course, but after today, you are no longer an employee here." His words struck her like a blow. "You're firing me because I'm pregnant? Because of you?" "I'm protecting my family, Amara. And you should protect yourself." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "If you try to come after me, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Amara's hands trembled, fury and disbelief warring inside her. She stood there, staring at the man she had trusted, the man who now saw her as a threat. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I never thought you'd do this." "You should never have thought anything else," Richard replied, his voice calm, as though this were just another business deal. Amara's vision blurred with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office. As she returned to her desk, her legs felt like they were moving on autopilot, her hands mechanically packing her things, each item slipping into her bag feeling heavier than the last. In the elevator, descending to the lobby, she caught her reflection in the polished walls, trying to hold herself together. But inside she was crumbling. Her job, her future, everything had been ripped away in a matter of minutes. And now she was alone. Pregnant, unemployed, blacklisted in the industry she had worked so hard to succeed in. The tears finally fell as she stepped out onto the street. She felt invisible, just another face in the crowd. No one would ever know the truth. Richard Collins had made sure of that. But as she walked away from the building that once held her future, she placed a hand on her stomach, where a new life was beginning to grow. She wasn't alone. She still had her child. And somehow they would survive. Tyrell spoke with his mother later, once she had calmed down. But now, standing at the base of the towering Collins Associates building, he felt the weight of her words gnawing at him. The glass tower loomed above, sleek and imposing, its mirrored surface reflecting the sunlight like a beacon of hope, or perhaps a warning. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. This is it, he thought. This is where everything begins. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere buzzed with the quiet hum of professionals moving swiftly, all focused, all driven. Tyrell checked in with the receptionist, and soon enough, Ms. Robinson, his supervisor, was leading him upstairs. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a brisk pace and eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome aboard, Tyrell," she said, stepping into the elevator. "We have high expectations for you." "Thank you, ma'am," Tyrell replied, his nerves shifting into excitement. "I'm ready to get started." Ms. Robinson gave a brief nod. "Good. Let's hope you live up to that potential." They walked through the office, a labyrinth of cubicles and glass-walled meeting rooms, everything immaculate and high-tech. The intensity of the place was palpable, with employees focused on their tasks, barely glancing up as they passed. Tyrell could feel the pressure to perform, to prove himself in this fast-paced environment. As they moved further into the floor, Tyrell spotted Richard Collins, the CEO himself, surrounded by senior executives. He felt a surge of admiration. This was the man who had built the company from the ground up, the embodiment of everything Tyrell aspired to be. But then Collins' gaze flicked briefly in his direction, their eyes meeting for just a second. Tyrell froze. Collins' face remained impassive, his expression neutral, yet there was something in his eyes, a fleeting recognition, almost like a shadow crossing over them. And then it was gone. Collins turned back to his conversation without another glance. Tyrell shook off the strange feeling and kept walking. It's just nerves, he told himself. Richard Collins didn't know him. How could he? Tyrell was just one of many new hires. Still, that brief moment lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Ms. Robinson led him to his desk, outlining his first set of tasks. Tyrell threw himself into the work, the excitement of starting fresh pushing aside any lingering doubts. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he belonged. But even as he focused on the reports in front of him, his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Some places have shadows, Tyrell, things you can't see until it's too late." He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He wasn't in danger here. He was here to succeed. Whatever shadows his mother feared couldn't touch him. Not now, not here. As the morning wore on, the office settled into a steady rhythm. The quiet hum of keyboards and low voices filled the air, everyone absorbed in their tasks. Tyrell worked through his assignments with determination, eager to make a good impression. Yet, despite his focus, the memory of that fleeting look from Richard Collins kept surfacing, pulling at his concentration. Why had Collins looked at him that way? Tyrell frowned, flipping through the pages of a dense report. It didn't make sense. Collins didn't know him, he couldn't. Tyrell was just another new hire in a company of hundreds, maybe even thousands. So why had the CEO noticed him? He shook off the thought again, chalking it up to first-day jitters. Lunchtime came and went, but Tyrell stayed at his desk, eating quickly so as not to waste a moment. He had heard the rumors. Collins Associates was a cutthroat environment, where employees were judged by their productivity, and he wasn't about to fall behind on his first day. The reports were challenging, but Tyrell tackled them with relentless focus, determined to stand out. Yet as the afternoon dragged on, that strange feeling from earlier persisted. It wasn't just about the way Richard Collins had looked at him, it was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of this pristine high-pressure workplace. It was as if an invisible weight was pressing down on him, a sense that there was more to this place than met the eye. Tyrell pushed the thoughts away, determined not to let them distract him. But deep down the unease remained, a quiet whisper at the back of his mind. What if his mother had been right all along? What if there were shadows here, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? For now, though, he focused on his work, determined to prove himself. Yet even as he pored over the reports, that nagging doubt gnawed at him, growing with each passing hour. The shadows his mother had warned him about, were they real? And if so, would he see them before it was too late? It was only later, when Miss Robinson came by to check on his progress, that the unease began to creep back in. "You're doing well, Tyrell," she said, glancing over his shoulder at the screen. "Good pace." "Thanks," Tyrell replied, leaning back slightly to stretch. "Just trying to keep up with everything." "You're handling it well, keep it up." She started to walk away but then stopped, her expression suddenly more serious. "Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Collins wants to see you in his office. Now." Tyrell blinked. "Mr. Collins? The CEO?" She didn't offer any further details. "He's on the 40th floor. You can head up now." And with that, Miss Robinson walked away, leaving Tyrell stunned at his desk. Why would Richard Collins, of all people, want to see him, especially on his first day? His heart began to pound as he stood up, adjusting his jacket. This wasn't normal. New hires didn't just get called in by the CEO out of nowhere. He looked around at his co-workers, but no one seemed to notice him or his growing anxiety as they continued with their work. Tyrell made his way to the elevator, his palms suddenly clammy. He tried to control his breathing. Maybe this was good news, right? Maybe Richard had seen something impressive in his resume, something that stood out. Maybe he just wanted to personally welcome Tyrell to the company. But even as he tried to reassure himself, a small, darker thought crept into the back of his mind. His mother's words from that morning echoed again. Some places have shadows. The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, and Tyrell was immediately greeted by an entirely different atmosphere. Unlike the busy, chaotic lower floors, the executive level was calm and polished, with floor-to-ceiling windows letting in the late afternoon light. Everything about the space screamed importance, from the sleek furniture to the soft carpet beneath his feet. He approached the receptionist's desk, ignoring the tightening knot in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Collins, Tyrell Grant." The receptionist, a woman with perfect posture and a warm smile, nodded and gestured toward the large wooden doors behind her. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Tyrell hesitated, his nerves now in overdrive. Then, taking a deep breath, he opened the doors and stepped into Richard Collins' office. The room was massive, with a sweeping view of the city skyline that made Tyrell feel even smaller than he already did. Richard was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, his back to the window, focused on some papers. He didn't look up immediately, and for a brief moment, Tyrell felt frozen, unsure of what to do. Finally, Richard raised his head, his face unreadable. "Tyrell. Come in. Have a seat." Tyrell crossed the room, his heart still racing, and sat down in the leather chair across from the desk. The silence in the office was almost suffocating. Richard's presence was even more intimidating than Tyrell had anticipated. "So," Richard began, his voice calm but measured. "How's your first day going?" Tyrell swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good, sir. I've been working on the reports Miss Robinson gave me. Everything's going smoothly so far." Richard nodded, setting the papers aside. His gaze sharpened slightly, studying Tyrell with a new intensity. "That's good to hear." For a moment there was silence. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Tyrell. There was something unnerving about the way he was looking at him, as if he was searching for something, trying to place him. Tyrell felt the tension building in the room. "Is there something specific you wanted to talk to me about, Mr. Collins?" Richard's expression didn't change. "You're new here, Tyrell. Just starting out. But your name caught my attention." Tyrell's chest tightened. "My name?" Richard's eyes narrowed just a fraction before he leaned forward slightly. "Grant, isn't it?" Tyrell nodded slowly, unsure where this was heading. "Yes, sir. Tyrell Grant." Richard's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before he leaned back in his chair, his face still inscrutable. "It's a strong name. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Tyrell's heart was pounding in his chest now. He could feel the weight of Richard's words hanging in the air. Could it be possible that Richard knew? That somehow, in this brief conversation, he had uncovered who Tyrell really was? But Richard didn't push further. Instead, he offered a faint smile, a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I like to keep an eye on new talent coming into the company. We expect great things from you, Tyrell. Keep up the good work." Tyrell forced a nod, not knowing what else to say. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Richard glanced at the papers on his desk, signaling the end of the conversation. "Good. You can get back to it then." Tyrell stood up, his legs feeling unsteady as he walked toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, Richard's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Tyrell?" Tyrell turned, his hand still on the door. If you ever need anything, Richard said, his tone still calm but laced with something Tyrell couldn't quite identify, my door is always open. Tyrell nodded again, swallowing hard. I'll keep that in mind. With that, he left the office, his heart still racing in his chest. The door closed softly behind him, and Tyrell stood in the quiet hallway, trying to process what had just happened. There was no reason for Richard Collins to take an interest in him, no reason for him to call Tyrell into his office on his very first day. And yet, something about the way Richard had looked at him, the way he had mentioned his name, felt like more than just a coincidence. The elevator ride back down felt longer than it should have. When Tyrell returned to his desk, the office noise washed over him, but it did little to ease the knot of discomfort twisting in his gut. His mother had been right. Something felt off about that place. Tyrell couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something crucial. The familiar click of the key in the lock greeted him as he opened the door to his apartment. The comforting scent of home wrapped around him. The smell of Amara's cooking, the light touch of lavender she always used to clean the place. For a moment, it was almost enough to dispel the strange tension that had followed him home from his first day at Collins Associates. Almost. He placed his briefcase gently by the door, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room. Amara was there, sitting on the couch with a book open in her lap, though her eyes weren't on the page. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "How was it?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with something Tyrell couldn't quite place. Tyrell hesitated. How could he describe his day? The excitement of starting a new chapter, the unsettling sensation of being watched, of being known? Richard Collins' eyes, that flicker of recognition. It had been a whirlwind of confusion, excitement, and unease, all rolled into one. "It was fine," Tyrell said, trying to sound convincing as he sat beside her on the couch. "Busy. They had me working on a lot of reports, just trying to get the lay of the land." Amara nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on him a little too long. She wasn't convinced. Did anything unusual happen? Tyrell paused, unsure how much to share. "Not really," he started but then stopped. There was no point in hiding it. His mother already seemed nervous about the job. "Well, actually, I met Richard Collins today." Amara's grip tightened around the edge of her book. "You met him?" Tyrell nodded. "Yeah, he called me into his office. I have no idea why. It was weird. I mean, he's the CEO. Why would he care about a new hire?" Amara remained silent, her eyes darkening as she looked away. Tyrell noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened at the mention of Richard. She wasn't surprised, not in the way he thought she'd be. There was something more going on. He leaned forward, his voice softening. "Mom, what is it? Why are you acting like this?" Amara's breath hitched in her throat. She placed the book on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Tyrell, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Tyrell frowned, his stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Richard Collins, he's not just your boss." Tyrell's pulse quickened, a cold wave of confusion washing over him. What are you talking about?" Amara's eyes met his, filled with regret and pain. "He's your father." For a second, the words didn't make sense. Tyrell blinked, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. His father? Richard Collins? The Richard Collins? Tyrell's voice came out as a whisper. That can't be right." Amara nodded, her voice shaky but firm. "It's true. Richard and I were involved a long time ago before you were born." Tyrell shook his head, disbelief hitting him like a brick. "But you said my father left. You never told me who he was." He stood up, running a hand through his hair as his mind raced. "How could you keep this from me? How could you not tell me?" Amara remained seated, her hands clasped tightly together. "I was trying to protect you, Tyrell. I didn't want you to grow up knowing what kind of man he is." Tyrell's voice rose, a mix of anger and shock. "What kind of man? You didn't think I deserved to know? To know who my father is?" Tears welled in Amara's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I didn't want you to get hurt. Richard, he didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He cut me off from everything. And when I tried to find work elsewhere, he blacklisted me across the entire industry." Tyrell froze, the weight of her words settling over him. "He blacklisted you?" Amara nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes. I couldn't get a job after that. I had no income, no support. It was just me and you, and I had to fight to survive. He didn't care. He just wanted me out of his life, and he did everything he could to make sure I never came back." Tyrell's stomach churned. The man he admired, the man he had just met in his office today, his father, had done this, had abandoned them before he was even born. Why didn't you tell me before? Tyrell asked, his voice lower now but still thick with hurt. All these years I wondered about him. I asked you but you never said anything. Why now? Amara's face crumpled and she sank back into the couch, her hands trembling. I thought I could keep it buried. I didn't want you to know what kind of man he is. But when you told me you got a job at Collins Associates, I couldn't hide it from you anymore. You deserve to know the truth, Tyrell. I just didn't know how to tell you. Tyrell stood there, staring at her, his chest tight with a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, sadness. All these years, he had been kept in the dark, and now everything was unraveling in front of him. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. Richard Collins, his father, had known about him this whole time. Not only had he abandoned them, but he had also actively worked to destroy his mother's career. Tyrell shook his head, disbelief and anger swirling inside him. I can't believe this, he muttered, pacing the room. I've been working for him, sitting in his office like any other employee, and all this time he knew. He had to know. Amara's voice was soft but firm as she interrupted. He doesn't know who you are, Tyrell. He didn't recognize you. That's not the point. Tyrell's voice cracked, his frustration boiling over. He abandoned us, Mom. He ruined your life. And now I'm just supposed to sit there and work for him like nothing ever happened. Amara's eyes pleaded with him, her voice almost breaking. I didn't tell you this so you'd hate him. I told you because I didn't want you going in blind. I couldn't bear to see you get close to him only to be hurt all over again. Tyrell's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as he struggled to get a grip on the chaos swirling in his mind. His entire life he'd imagined his father as a mystery, a man who simply vanished. But the truth? It was far worse. He rubbed his hands over his face, trying to clear his thoughts. I don't even know what to do now. Should I confront him? Should I just quit? Amara stood up and gently placed a hand on his arm. That's your decision, Tyrell. But think carefully. Richard is powerful. He could ruin you just like he did to me. Tyrell met her gaze, anger still simmering in his chest. I'm not afraid of him. He can't hurt me the way he hurt you. Amara sighed, her expression heavy with concern. I just want you to be safe. He stared at her, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had no idea what his next move would be, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep working for Richard Collins as if nothing had changed. The man who abandoned him and destroyed his mother's life wasn't just some CO to him anymore. He was the man who had shattered his world before he was even born. I'll figure it out, Tyrell said at last, his voice steady. But I can't keep working there. Not after this. Amara nodded, her expression softening as she took a step back. Whatever you decide, Tyrell, I'm with you. Tyrell took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. Everything had changed in the span of a few minutes. The job that had seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime now felt like a betrayal. And the man he had admired, the one he had shaken hands with, wasn't just a distant, successful figure anymore. He was a stranger who had caused more damage than Tyrell ever could have imagined. As he sat down beside his mother again, the reality of it all settled deep within him. The life he thought he knew was gone. And now he had to figure out what to do with the pieces left behind. 2 days later, Tyrell found himself sitting on the subway, staring out the window as the train hurtled through dark tunnels. His reflection flickered in the glass, almost unrecognizable to him now. Since the moment his mother told him the truth, everything he thought he knew about his life had been turned upside down. Richard Collins was his father. The thought clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Every time he replayed that conversation in his mind, it made him angrier. His father, the man he had met on his first day at Collins Associates, had looked at him like he was nobody, just another employee. The same man who had wrecked his mother's career, blacklisted her from the industry, and abandoned them without a second thought. And now Tyrell was working for him as if none of that had happened. The subway jolted to a stop, pulling Tyrell from his thoughts. He needed to pull himself together before stepping into the office. He couldn't afford to let anyone see how close he was to breaking down. Not yet. Not until he figured out what his next move was. The crisp morning air hit him as he exited the station and joined the busy streets of Midtown. Collins Associates loomed ahead, its sleek glass tower piercing the sky. Once, it had seemed like a beacon of success, a place where he could finally prove himself. Now, it felt more like a prison, trapping him in a twisted game he didn't even know he was playing. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm when Tyrell stepped inside. Phones rang, voices hummed, and the steady clatter of keyboards filled the air. No one paid much attention to him as he made his way to his desk, which was just fine with him. He needed time to think. But the moment he sat down, the weight of everything hit him again. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking on the screen, but he couldn't focus. Every task felt meaningless in the shadow of what he now knew. How could he sit here and act like everything was normal? How could he work for a man who had walked away from his responsibilities, who had abandoned him and his mother without a second thought? The worst part was Richard didn't even remember him. Tyrell had seen it in his eyes that first day, the brief flicker of recognition that quickly faded. To Richard, he was just another employee, another face in the crowd. He had no idea who Tyrell really was. And that made Tyrell's blood boil even more. He couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. Tyrell stood just inside the restaurant, his heart racing as he scanned the crowd. His eyes locked on Richard Collins, seated at a table by the window, laughing casually with his wife, Catherine, and their son, Elijah. They looked so at ease, enjoying their evening, oblivious to the storm brewing in Tyrell's chest. He clenched his fists, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He couldn't sit back any longer, couldn't let Richard carry on with his life as if nothing had happened. The betrayal, the abandonment, it all simmered inside him, threatening to boil over. Tyrell had spent years imagining this man, his father, as a distant figure, a mystery that had haunted his thoughts since childhood. And now, the man was sitting just a few feet away, unaware that everything was about to change. As Tyrell approached the table, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. The soft clink of silverware and murmured conversations became distant as his focus zeroed in on Richard. At first, Richard didn't notice him. He was too busy gesturing animatedly, spinning some story that had his family smiling. But then Richard's eyes flicked up and their gazes locked. The recognition was immediate. Richard's smile faltered, the joy in his expression dissolving into confusion and then something darker, fear maybe. For a brief moment, the air between them was thick with silence, a tension so palpable that Tyrell could feel it pressing down on his chest. He stopped just at the edge of the table, his heart pounding so loudly that he could hardly hear anything else. This was it. The moment where everything would come crashing down. Tyrell? Richard's voice was low, hesitant, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tyrell's jaw clenched as he fought to control the fury rising inside him. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice hard. "You didn't recognize me before, did you?" Richard glanced at Catherine, who looked between the two men, her confusion growing. Elijah, too young to understand, simply stared at Tyrell with wide eyes. "Let's not do this here," Richard began, his voice barely above a whisper, but Tyrell wasn't having it. "Why not?" Tyrell snapped. "You've spent years pretending I don't exist. You destroyed my mother's life. You left us with nothing. And now you want to act like this is some kind of private matter." Richard's face paled, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. Tyrell could see the fear in him now, the cracks forming in the calm, composed exterior that Richard always maintained. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Richard muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't the time or place." "I'm done waiting for the right time," Tyrell said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I deserve answers. You walked out on us, left my mother blacklisted and struggling to survive while you went on to build this empire. You have no idea what that did to us." Catherine reached out, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "Richard, what's going on?" But Richard didn't answer. He just stared at Tyrell, the color draining from his face as the weight of the truth settled over him. For once, he couldn't talk his way out of this. For once, he couldn't hide behind his power and wealth. Tyrell took a deep breath, the anger inside him shifting, turning into something heavier. "You can't keep pretending like none of this matters," he said, his voice softer now but no less intense. "I'm your son. You left me behind and now you're going to face what you did." For a moment, Richard seemed frozen, unable to respond. The restaurant buzzed quietly around them, patrons unaware of the emotional storm brewing at the table by the window. Finally, Richard swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "Tyrell, I didn't know." Tyrell's eyes flashed with disbelief. "You didn't know?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't care." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of pain and betrayal. Richard's shoulders slumped slightly, the confident businessman crumbling under the weight of his past mistakes. "I was wrong," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "I made mistakes." Tyrell felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow flood through him. He had wanted this confrontation for so long, had dreamed of making Richard admit his failures. But now that it was happening, the victory felt hollow. Nothing Richard could say would fix what he had broken. The damage was done. "I'm not here for an apology," Tyrell said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just needed you to know. To see me? To face what you did? Richard looked down at the table, unable to meet his son's eyes. I'm sorry. Tyrell took a step back, the tension slowly releasing from his body. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was time to walk away. Without another word, Tyrell turned and left the restaurant, the cold night air hitting him as he stepped outside. His heart still pounded in his chest, but for the first time in days he felt a sense of relief. The man who had once been a mystery was no longer a looming shadow in his life. Tyrell had faced him, and though the scars would remain, he no longer carried the weight of silence. Now he could move on, free from the past that had haunted him for so long. Richard Collins sat at the corner table, his back to the window while his wife, Catherine, sat beside him. Her perfectly styled hair gleamed under the chandelier's light. Across from them sat their son, Elijah, embodying the image of a young man destined for success. They laughed together, unaware of the storm brewing nearby. Tyrell wiped his sweaty palms, knowing this was the moment he'd been preparing for. But now, standing so close, doubt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his mind. His hands tensed at his sides as he approached their table, each step heavier than the last. Richard looked up first, their eyes meeting across the room. Tyrell saw the flicker of recognition in Richard's eyes, quickly followed by the clenching of his jaw. The easy smile that had graced Richard's face just moments before vanished, replaced by something colder, something that couldn't be hidden. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Tyrell's heart pounded in his chest and Richard's gaze hardened, his body tensing as if bracing for impact. Tyrell stopped just a foot away, casting a shadow over their perfect family dinner. "Tyrell," Richard said, his voice low. His eyes darted briefly to his wife and son before returning to Tyrell. "What are you doing here?" Tyrell's pulse quickened at the sound of Richard's voice. It wasn't welcoming, it was defensive, controlled. Tyrell glanced at Catherine and Elijah, who were both staring at him in confusion. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Richard," Tyrell said, his voice steady but thick with tension. "Dinner?" Catherine raised an eyebrow, turning to her husband. "Richard, is he from the office?" Richard cleared his throat, his expression tight. "Yes, Tyrell's a new employee." "A new employee?" Catherine echoed, her gaze flicking between Tyrell and Richard, sensing something was amiss. Elijah, seated across the table, leaned forward, eyeing Tyrell up and down. "Doesn't look like a typical work meeting, Dad. What's going on?" Tyrell clenched his fists at his sides, his chest tightening with the weight of everything unsaid. He could feel Richard's silent plea for him to back down, to walk away, but Tyrell had come too far to turn back now. "I'm not here for work," Tyrell said, his voice stronger, this time directed squarely at Richard. "I'm here for something else, something that happened a long time ago." Richard's face darkened, his shoulders stiffening. For the first time, Tyrell saw a flash of something like fear in his eyes. Catherine, sensing the shift, leaned closer to her husband, her brow furrowed. "Richard," she asked quietly, "what is he talking about?" Richard didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, his hand steady, but his grip tighter than necessary. He took a slow sip of wine, his gaze never leaving Tyrell. "This isn't the time or place for this," Richard said, his voice tense. But Tyrell didn't back down. His eyes flicked to Catherine, then to Elijah before locking back onto Richard. "I think this is exactly the time and place." A heavy silence fell over the table, the kind that stretches painfully, like the moment before a dam breaks. Tyrell's voice dropped, filled with barely restrained anger. "You know who I am, don't you, Richard?" Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with an emotion Tyrell couldn't quite place. Panic, perhaps, or maybe anger at being cornered. "Tyrell," Richard said calmly, trying to regain control, "we can discuss this later." "No," Tyrell said, his voice rising slightly. "We're talking about it now, in front of them." Elijah frowned, looking from Tyrell to his father. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Catherine's hand touched Richard's arm, her face etched with concern. "Richard, what's going on? Why does he seem so angry?" Richard's face was stone, his eyes fixed on Tyrell, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. He didn't want this conversation to happen here. He didn't want the truth to come out. And that only fueled Tyrell's determination. Taking a deep breath, Tyrell steadied himself. "I'm not just some new employee at your company. I'm the son you abandoned." Catherine's eyes widened in shock, her hand freezing in midair. "What?" Elijah's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, his mouth slightly open as he stared at Tyrell, then at his father. Richard remained silent, his face pale but his jaw clenched. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Tyrell took another step closer to the table, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. 24 years ago you fired my mother. Blacklisted her in the industry. Left her with nothing. And then you disappeared. Now I'm here working for you, while you sit here pretending like none of it ever happened. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Richard, is this true? Elijah's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at his father. Dad, what is he talking about? Richard said nothing. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, too real to avoid, too overwhelming to deny. His silence was the only answer they needed. Tears filled Catherine's eyes, her voice trembling as she looked at Richard. You have another son? You did this to someone and you never told me? Tyrell felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly as the truth finally began to crack through the carefully constructed life Richard had built. He looked at Richard, his anger giving way to something else, something almost like pity. You ruined her life, Tyrell continued, his voice lower now, more controlled. You left us with nothing. And you think you can just keep living like none of it ever happened. Richard's face had drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, Tyrell saw him not as the powerful CEO he had always seemed to be, but as a man trapped in the collapse of his own lies. Catherine's voice broke through the tension, barely a whisper. Richard, how could you? Richard finally spoke, but his voice was hoarse, weak. I made a mistake. I didn't think. You didn't think I'd come back for you, Tyrell finished for him. But I did. Elijah's face had hardened, his eyes flashing with anger as he looked at his father. Dad, you really did this? You have a son and you never told us? Richard's hand trembled as he set his glass down on the table, his eyes darting between his family and Tyrell, trapped in a moment he could no longer control. I thought it was over. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Tyrell shook his head, bitterness creeping into his voice. It never ends, Richard. You hurt my mother. You hurt me. And now you're going to have to face it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The low hum of the restaurant seemed to fade, leaving only the heavy weight of the truth hanging in the air. Catherine's tears fell silently, her gaze fixed on the man she thought she knew. Elijah's fists clenched on the table, his knuckles white with anger. Richard's eyes finally met Tyrell's once more, and this time there was no more denial, only the crushing weight of a past that had finally caught up with him. The restaurant seemed cold now, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting long shadows over the table as the conversation around them continued, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding before them. Richard Collins sat frozen at the table, his world unraveling as Catherine wiped her tears, her hand trembling as she set it down in front of her. Richard, she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. You've been lying to me, for years, to all of us. Richard remained motionless, the color drained from his face. His once steady hands now trembled slightly, and the man who had always seemed so solid, so impenetrable, now appeared small and defeated, as if the weight of his lies had finally crushed him. Elijah leaned forward, his voice tight with barely contained anger. You have another son? You ruined someone's life and you thought we'd never find out. Tyrell stood at the edge of the table, his chest heaving with a storm of emotions, anger, hurt, and something akin to vindication. The truth was finally out, and Richard could no longer hide behind his wealth or power. He was exposed and there was no retreat. Richard's eyes flickered to Tyrell for a brief moment, then back to his wife and son. I didn't want to hurt you, he stammered, his voice hoarse. I thought it was over. It was a mistake a long time ago. A mistake. Tyrell's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. You didn't just make a mistake. You destroyed my mother's life. You blacklisted her, left her with nothing. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You blacklisted her? Her voice shook with disbelief. Richard, how could you do something like that? Richard's face twisted, the calm mask he had worn for years shattering in front of his family. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He looked cornered, as if all the secrets he had kept buried for so long were crashing down around him, and now there was no way out. I didn't have a choice, he finally whispered, his voice low, almost pleading. I couldn't let it get out. I had a family, a career. I had to protect everything I'd built. Elijah shot up from his chair, the sound of it scraping against the floor loud in the tense air. So you protected yourself and left them to suffer? His voice dripped with disgust. You didn't care about them. You only cared about your reputation. Tyrell watched as the once untouchable man now appeared completely defeated. Richard's hands shook as he picked up his glass, taking a long drink of wine, his gaze unfocused as if he couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. Silent tears slid down Catherine's face as she shook her head in disbelief. I trusted you, Richard. I built a life with you. How could you lie to me like this? How could you do this to your own child? The word child hung in the air, its weight pressing down on the table like a physical presence. Richard's face contorted with guilt, his eyes finally lifting to meet Catherine's. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought, if I buried it, it would go away, that I could protect you from it. Catherine let out a bitter laugh, her voice breaking. Protect me? You didn't protect anyone, Richard. You only protected yourself. Tyrell stood with his fists clenched at his sides. You thought you could erase us, pretend we didn't exist. But we do exist, Richard. We've lived with the consequences of your choices every single day. Richard's eyes gleamed with something like shame, but it was too late. He had lived his life in comfort, building an empire while Amara had struggled to raise Tyrell on her own. There was no excuse, no justification that could ever make up for that. Elijah's face hardened, his voice thick with revulsion. You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect image, but it's all a lie, isn't it? How many other secrets are there? How many other people have you hurt? Richard shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. There's no one else, I swear. You expect us to believe you? Catherine's voice cracked again, her eyes red and swollen from crying. After all this, after more than 20 years of lies? I don't even know who you are anymore, Richard. Tyrell's heart twisted at the sight of Catherine's pain. She had been caught in the middle of this, completely unaware of the life her husband had left behind. But Tyrell couldn't allow himself to pity her, not yet. She was as much a victim of Richard's lies as he and his mother had been, but there was still so much she didn't know. You're not the only one he hurt, Tyrell said calmly, his voice carrying a cold rage. My mother, Amara. After Richard fired her, she tried to recover. She sought work everywhere, but wherever she went, she was shunned. He blacklisted her, ruined her reputation. While he was here, living his life as if nothing had happened, she struggled for years. Catherine's face contorted as the full weight of Tyrell's words sank in. She turned to Richard, her voice barely above a whisper. You did this to her. You ruined her life just to protect your own. Richard's hands trembled as he set his glass down on the table. His eyes filled with guilt and regret. I didn't know what else to do, he said weakly. I was afraid. Terrified. Elijah's voice rose in disbelief. Afraid? That's your excuse. Tyrell felt his anger boiling up again, but this time, it wasn't just for himself. It was for his mother, for all the years she had fought, all the sacrifices she had made just to keep them afloat. Richard's fear had cost them everything. You can't use fear as an excuse, Tyrell said, his voice shaking with fury. You haven't lost everything like we have. Richard looked at Tyrell, his eyes filling with what almost seemed like remorse. He whispered, empty and weak, I'm sorry. But Tyrell wasn't interested in apologies. Not now, not after everything. Sorry doesn't change anything, Tyrell said, his voice cold. Sorry doesn't fix what you've done. You can't just apologize and walk away. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Catherine cut him off, her voice trembling with rage. Tyrell's right. You can't fix this with an apology, Richard. You lied to us and you destroyed our lives. She turned to Tyrell, her expression softening as new tears welled up in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Tyrell. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. Tyrell looked at her, his anger still simmering, but he nodded. I know it's not your fault. Elijah, who had been silent for a moment, spoke again, his voice filled with disbelief. So what now? What do we do with this, Dad? Pretend nothing happened. Richard didn't answer. He stared at the table, his hands trembling, his face pale. The man who once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now a shadow of the person he had pretended to be. We can't pretend anymore, Catherine said quietly, her voice heavy with pain. We have to face it. Tyrell's chest tightened as he watched Richard, this man who had caused so much damage, sitting there in silence, unable to answer for his actions. The truth had finally come out, and now the family he had built was crumbling around him. I've said what I needed to say, Tyrell said, his voice steady but cold. Now it's up to you to deal with it. Catherine's tears fell freely now, and even Elijah, who had been full of anger moments before, seemed lost. The weight of Richard's betrayal had shattered their family, and there was no turning back. Richard finally looked up, his voice barely a whisper. I'll fix this. I'll make it right. But Tyrell shook his head. You can't fix this, Richard. You can't undo what you've done. He walked away from the table, leaving them to face the truth. As he left the restaurant, a small part of the weight on his chest lifted. The confrontation was over, and the truth had been revealed. But the damage had been done and there was no way to turn back. The buzz at Collins Associates was different today. Conversations that were usually light and professional now had a sharp edge. Gossip eyes darted toward Richard Collins' office, the glass walls seeming more transparent than ever, as if everyone in the building could see the cracks forming around the man who had built an empire. Tyrell sat at his desk, watching the people around him. The news had spread faster than he had anticipated, and whispers had turned into open discussions. Everyone knew that Richard Collins, the untouchable CEO, was no longer invincible. He stared at the report in front of him, the words a blur. He should have felt some sense of satisfaction, knowing that the man who had ruined his mother's life was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But instead, a silent void had settled within him. The anger that had driven him to confront Richard was no longer burning so fiercely. Now only the fallout remained. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. A message from his mother. "How are you?" Tyrell sighed and typed a quick reply. "It's all over the office now. Everyone knows." Her response came almost immediately. "Are you okay?" He hesitated before answering. "I think so. Just trying to figure out what comes next." Tyrell leaned back in his chair, looking across the frosted glass office where Richard's door remained shut. No one had seen him come in today and rumors were already swirling. Some said he was hiding at home, avoiding the public eye. Others speculated that he was meeting with lawyers, trying to shield himself from the storm brewing around him. It didn't matter now. The truth was out and there was no turning back. At noon, Tyrell's phone rang again, but this time, it wasn't a message from his mother. It was an email from the company. The subject line was simple: company announcement. His heart raced as he clicked to open it. "Dear team. Effective immediately, Richard Collins has stepped down as CEO of Collins Associates. The board of directors has appointed an interim CEO while the company undergoes this transition. During this period, we remain committed to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the company. Thank you for your continued dedication during this time." Tyrell's grip tightened around his phone. It was done. Richard was out. He sat there for a moment, staring at the email, letting the words sink in. The man who had wielded so much power, who had made decisions that destroyed lives without a second thought, had finally lost his seat at the top. But it wasn't the victory Tyrell had imagined. He had envisioned this moment so many times. The fall of Richard, his public humiliation. But now that it was real, it didn't feel like he thought it would. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of closure. Just emptiness. His phone vibrated again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message from his mother. "I just saw the news. Are you okay with this?" He stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Yes, it's over. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would." Her response came more slowly this time, more measured. "It won't feel like you expected, Tyrell. But you did what you had to do. You faced him. That's what matters." Tyrell closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over him. She was right. He had done what needed to be done. The truth had been revealed and Richard was gone. But the cost of it all still weighed heavily on his chest. Later that afternoon, the whispers in the office had turned into intense discussions. Tyrell kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances from some of his colleagues. He didn't want to be part of the gossip. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to get through the day. But as the hours dragged on, Tyrell knew he couldn't avoid it forever. At some point he would have to face the reality of what had happened, not just with Richard but with himself. He had spent so long building up to this confrontation, so long imagining what it would be like to finally make Richard Collins pay for what he had done. But now that it was all over, Tyrell was left with the fallout. He was still working at the company Richard had built, a company that, in part, had been built on lies. A knock on his desk jolted Tyrell from his thoughts. He looked up to see his supervisor, Miss Robinson, standing there with an unreadable expression. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of seriousness. Tyrell nodded, following her to a quiet conference room at the back of the office. The room was small, its glass walls offering a view of the bustling floor outside. Miss Robinson closed the door behind them, crossing her arms over her chest and leaning against the table. She began, her tone measured. "I'm sure you've seen the news." Tyrell nodded, unsure where this conversation was headed. "Yes." She watched him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I know about your connection to Richard." Tyrell's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't anticipated this. Miss Robinson nodded slowly. "The news spreads quickly. I don't know all the details, but people are talking." Tyrell felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the fear of exposure creeping in. "What exactly are they saying?" she sighed, running a hand through her hair. Mostly that you're his son. The confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private. Tyrell's stomach dropped. He hadn't considered that the restaurant, filled with people eager for gossip as much as for their meals, would be a breeding ground for rumors. I didn't want this to happen. I just needed to confront him for what he did. Miss Robinson's expression softened. I understand. I don't blame you, but you need to be careful. This company is in a difficult position right now. With Richard's departure, there will be a lot of scrutiny. People will be watching you. Tyrell swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to decide what you want to do, she said calmly. Staying here, working for the company your father built, will come with its own set of challenges. People will ask questions and demand answers. Tyrell looked at her, his mind racing. He had been so focused on confronting Richard and making him face the truth that he hadn't considered the repercussions of remaining at the company. It was no longer just about the job, it was about being in the shadow of his father's legacy. You don't have to decide right now, Miss Robinson added, her voice gentler. But think about it. This place is changing and you need to figure out if you want to be a part of that change. Tyrell nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Thank you. I'll think about it. Miss Robinson gave him a small nod before leaving the room, leaving Tyrell alone with his thoughts. By the time he left the office that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. He walked slowly, his mind heavy with everything that had happened. Richard was gone, forced out by the truth Tyrell had exposed. But now Tyrell was left with a choice. He could stay at Collins Associates, knowing the history behind the company's success, or he could move on, leaving his father's shadow behind and forging a new path. He didn't have an answer yet. All he knew was that the truth had changed everything, and now he had to figure out where he went from here. When he arrived at his apartment, his phone buzzed again, another message from his mother. Come home. We'll figure this out together. Tyrell smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. He had faced the past. Now it was time to decide what kind of future he wanted to build. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the comforting warmth of his mother's apartment. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of the radio in the background. It was a tranquil and peaceful moment, but the weight of the past few days still lingered. Amara was at the stove, her back to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't said much since he walked in the night before, and Tyrell knew she was waiting for him to share what had happened and what he planned to do next. He hadn't figured that out yet, but at least here in this small, familiar space, the world didn't seem quite so heavy. Amara set the pot aside and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Do you want to talk about it? Tyrell looked at her, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, more than he could hide. Richard's gone. The company has already announced it. Amara's eyes softened as she took a seat across from him. I heard. They're calling it a scandal. Tyrell nodded, rubbing his hands together as he struggled to find the right words. It doesn't feel like I thought it would, Mom. I thought I'd feel something more. Relief maybe. Satisfaction. But I don't. Amara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. That's because it's not just about him. It's about everything we've been through, and nothing he does now can undo what's already happened. Tyrell looked at her hand, the lines of wear and resilience etched into her skin. She had carried so much weight for so many years, and now, even with Richard out of the picture, the scars remained. I don't know what to do next, Tyrell admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Staying at the company feels wrong, but leaving? I don't know if that's the answer either. Amara nodded, her eyes full of understanding. You don't have to decide everything right now, Tyrell. You've already done the hardest part. You confronted him. You made him face the truth. Tyrell swallowed hard, the memories of that confrontation still fresh in his mind. I keep thinking about all those years, all those times I asked about my father and you couldn't tell me the truth. Now that I know, it feels like it wasn't worth it. Amara's expression softened further as she leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. It was worth it, Tyrell. You deserve to know the truth. No matter how painful, you needed to hear it. Tyrell let out a trembling sigh, the weight of her words settling in. She was right. Even though the truth had shattered the image of his father he had once held, it was still the truth. And now, with everything out in the open, he could finally start to move forward. I just don't know where to go from here, Tyrell said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara's hand tightened around his, her gaze steady and filled with resolve. You're stronger than you realize, Tyrell, she said softly. You've been through so much and come out the other side. Now you have the power to decide what comes next. You can build the life you want without anyone holding you back. Tyrell met her eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. You're right, he said quietly. I can move forward with this. Amara's tired smile was small but carried a world of strength. We both can. The day stretched on slowly but was filled with small moments of comfort. Tyrell stayed with his mother, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner together, and sharing stories about anything but Richard Collins. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to relish the simplicity of being together, free from the shadow of the past. Later that night, as they sat on the couch watching a rerun of an old comedy, Tyrell turned to Amara, the question that had been on his mind all day finally surfacing. Do you think we'll ever truly get justice for what he did? Amara's gaze remained fixed on the TV, her face thoughtful. In a way we already have, she said. Tyrell frowned, confused. What do you mean? She turned to him, her expression calm yet resolute. Justice isn't always about punishment, Tyrell. Sometimes it's about survival. Richard may have ruined my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. We survived. And now we're stronger than we would have been if he'd stayed in our lives. Tyrell looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. Despite everything Richard had done, despite the obstacles he'd placed in their way, they had built a life. It hadn't been easy and it hadn't always been fair, but they had persevered. Justice isn't just about seeing him fall, Amara continued, her voice firm. It's about us staying strong and moving forward. Tyrell felt a lump form in his throat, emotions swirling inside him, too complex to articulate. He had spent so long fixated on the idea of bringing Richard down, on making him pay for his wrongs. But now, sitting here with his mother, he realized that the true victory was in their resilience, in the fact that they had made it through despite everything. I think you're right, Tyrell said softly, a small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. We're still here. Amara squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with pride. And we always will be. The next morning, Tyrell woke up feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer felt as suffocating. As he made his way to the kitchen to brew coffee, the morning light streamed through the window, casting a serene glow over the quiet world outside. While he prepared a cup for himself and his mother, he mulled over the choices that lay ahead. He could stay at Collins Associates, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the company represented everything he wanted to leave behind. It was Richard's legacy, not his. He needed a fresh start to build something of his own, untainted by the shadow of his father's past. Amara entered the kitchen in her robe and greeted him with a warm smile. Good morning, she said, her voice gentle and comforting. Morning, Tyrell replied, handing her a cup of coffee. They sat together at the table, the peaceful stillness of the morning settling around them. For a long time neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There was a newfound peace between them, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. Finally, Tyrell broke the silence. I think I'm going to leave Collins Associates. Amara looked at him, her expression calm yet supportive. You don't have to decide right now. I know, Tyrell said, taking a sip of his coffee. But I think it's the right decision. I can't stay there working under the shadow of what he did. I need to do something else, something that's mine. Amara nodded, her eyes shining with pride. I think that's a good idea. Tyrell smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Yes, it is. They spent a little longer at the table, discussing their future and the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in years, Tyrell felt that he had control over his own life. The past would always be there, but it no longer had the power to define him. He had faced his father, uncovered the truth, and now he was free to build the life he wanted. One defined by his own choices, not Richard's mistakes. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Tyrell looked at his mother, his heart full of gratitude for everything they had been through together. We did it, he said softly, a small smile on his lips. Amara smiled back, her eyes filled with love and pride. Yes, we did. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.